Continuing here in the words of Rabbi Chaim Kanievsky on the Haggadah, it says in the Haggadah, Lo yidei malach, when HaKadosh Baruch Hu saved Klal Yisrael, v'yotzeinu Hashem miMitzrayim, He took us out of Mitzrayim, Lo yidei malach, it was not through a malach, through an angel, v'lo yidei sarav, another kind of an angel, v'lo yidei shaliach, and not through a messenger. So ask Rabbi Chaim Kanievsky, why doesn't it say that it was done through a messenger? Moshe Rabbeinu was the greatest messenger of all of Klal Yisrael, of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Moshe Rabbeinu was sent into, the Rambam's language about Moshe Rabbeinu is, Asa HaKadosh Baruch Hu Moshe, Hashem made Moshe Rabbeinu, and He sent him into Mitzrayim to go and be the Moshiach, to be the representative of Hashem, to rescue and to save Klal Yisrael. So what would be so terrible if the Haggadah would say that Hashem actually did do the Yitzi, He did bring about the Geula, the redemption, al yidei shaliach, through a messenger. And furthermore, he asked a very famous question. The whole story of Yitzias Mitzrayim, the protagonist is Moshe Rabbeinu. From the time that he's an infant and he's sailing down the Nile River until he becomes the leader of Klal Yisrael, and he takes them out of Mitzrayim and he brings the plagues and he parts the sea and he brings them to Har Sinai that they get the Torah. The Haggadah does not mention the name of Moshe Rabbeinu. It's like writing a story and forgetting to name the main character of the story. How come the Haggadah never mentions the name of Moshe Rabbeinu? So he answers that the fact that the Haggadah omits the name of Moshe Rabbeinu is a sign of the greatness of Moshe as a leader of Klal Yisrael. And a leader of Klal Yisrael and as the messenger of Hashem. And that is that a real messenger who is sent by a master, sent by another person to do his mission, he has one thing to do and one thing only. He is there to fulfill the will of the Meshaleach, of the one that is sending him. And if his mission is to say words to somebody, he will say over exactly what it is that the Meshaleach, the one that sent him, the one that he said. If his job is to go and save somebody, so that he will do the job that he has done, he doesn't need a pat on the back. He doesn't need a reward, because that's the job that he is being, we'll call it paid for. That's the job that he is being set up for. Moshe Rabbeinu was the prime shaliach, the messenger of Hashem. And he understood that his whole job in this world is to do exactly what HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants him to do. And he excelled beyond belief in his role as a messenger of Hashem. And therefore, says the Rav Chaim Kanievsky, Moshe did not add anything of his own to Yitzias Mitzrayim. He didn't add his own ideas into saving Klal Yisrael. HaKadosh Baruch Hu, you tell me what to do, and I'm going to do it. That's the quintessential Eved Hashem, which is one of the reasons the Haftarah of Shabbos, which is the final Haftarah in all of the final Nevuah of all of Klal Yisrael. It says, Zichru Toras Moshe Avdi. Just remember, in all the generations of the Galus, remember the Torah of Moshe, my servant. Because that's who Moshe Rabbeinu was. He was an Eved, he was a servant of Hashem, and he did exactly as he was supposed to do. And that's why the Haggadah doesn't mention him by name. Because Moshe Rabbeinu was mevatel. He completely nullified and subdued himself to the Ribono Shel Olam. And therefore, as a result, the Haggadah doesn't mention his name. Going a little bit further in the Haggadah, it says over here that as it's going through the Makkos, to Hashem came with an outstretched arm, Zu HaCherev, which is referring to the sword. So if Chaim Kanievsky asked, where do we see that HaKadosh Baruch Hu punished the Mitzrayim, the Egyptians, with a sword? We know all the Makkos that there were, the 10 Makkos, doesn't mention anything that Hashem came with a sword and then he chopped off people's heads. It doesn't say anything about that. It doesn't say by Kriyas Yamsuf that there were swords that were flying through the air and it got all the Mitzrayim. So how does the Haggadah come up with saying that Hashem punished the Mitzrayim with swords? Where did the swords come from? So he says the Pashat of Pshat is, the simple explanation is that Makos Bechoros, which was the death of the firstborn, so that striking all of the firstborn dead, it's equivalent to the sword coming and taking the lives of all of them. However, he writes that in the Midrashim, in the Mechilta, it points out that by Kriyas Yamsuf, it says that there was the splitting of by Kriyas Yamsuf, the splitting of the sea. So it says that there were malachim, there were angels that came along, and they were throwing arrows and stones at the Egyptians, killing many of them in that way, as if by sword. So he says, if you look at the Mechilta also, you'll understand. And he says even the water, the way that it was striking the Mitzrayim, some of it came by a very strong force. And he said those blows of the force of the water also like the swords. So he says we know, as the Midrash tells us, that all of the makos, or all of the punishments that the Egyptians received, everything was midah keneged midah, it was all measure for measure. So he said, what was the midah keneged midah? What was the measure for measure of HaKadosh Baruch Hu coming with these swords and killing the Mitzrayim? What were the swords that the Mitzrayim used on the Jewish people? We find that they made their life miserable. They whipped them with whips. They made them have a very harsh avodah, very harsh servitude. But where were the swords? So the Midrash tells us that Paro got tsaras, and one of the ways that he tried to heal himself from the tsaras, from the leprosy, was they thought that if you bathe in blood, the blood is going to heal you from the tsaras. So the Midrash explains that he slaughtered hundreds of Yiddish children in order to bathe in their blood to try to cure himself of the tsaras, which of course did not work. And therefore that slaughtering is considered the swords that they used, and therefore midah keneged midah, they were punished with the swords as well. I'm skipping now more. I'm going to try to get through the Haggadah as much as we can before Pesach. He starts going through the makos, through the plagues themselves. And he mentions the very famous question by the frogs, by the tzvardeim, and he mentions it in the name of his father, the stipler. We know that one of the pshatim in the Midrash is that there was really only one big, gigantic frog that came out of the Nile River, and the first Mitzri saw this big, croaking frog, and he took a stick and he hit it, and more frogs popped out. He got agitated, he hit the more frogs and even more frogs. And the more that they hit the frogs, the more they came out. So the stipler asked the very famous question, hello, what are you doing? If you realize that hello, that's good, it gets everyone's attention. Yeah, if you realize that every time you hit the frog, so more frogs pop out, so then a normal person puts two and two together and they stop hitting the frogs. And yet we find that the Mitzvah just kept pounding and pounding and pounding until the entire country was filled with frogs. So the stipler points out, this is the midah of kas. This is the trait of anger. Anger makes a person lose their senses. A sensible person would have stopped a long time ago from hitting the frogs. But when you get caught in the spell of kas, of anger, you have no control anymore over what you do. And the more that something angers you and agitates you, the more you respond with more anger towards it. And so through the trait of kas, of anger, the Mitzrayim ended up destroying the country with the plague of the frogs, of the tzvardeya, because they allowed their anger to blind them. They went into a rage and they kept hitting and hitting and hitting. If they would have just controlled their anger from the beginning, they could have averted the severity of the makkah of tzvardeya. So he says over the following idea. He says that Reb Chaim once heard someone speaking very improperly, and I'll end with this. And he rebuked them, and he gave them the following lesson when he heard what they had said. And he said it over in the name of Rabbi Yosef Chaim Sonnenfeld, who was, in the turn of the century, was the chief rabbi of Yerushalayim. And he says, when the Yidden left Egypt, so we know that the dogs did not bark. Caleb did not bark. A single dog did not bark. Allowed the Jews to leave peacefully without any anxiety with the hearing these barking dogs. So what's the schar? What is the reward that the dogs get? The reward is that any time that you have an avela, you have an animal that either died in the improper way or was shechted and it's not kosher the way that it is, so you take the extra meat and you throw it out to the dogs. Why? Because whatever the reason is, that since that they were quiet while we were running out of Mitzrayim, I think the Maharal has a whole pshat over there in the Gur Aryeh, that it was since that they were quiet while we were running out of Egypt, so therefore we're going to reward them with something. So the meat that a human being can't eat, we'll give it to the dogs. Nice, the dogs get to eat their alpo when they're hungry. So he says, I don't understand. The dogs only kept their mouths quiet when the Yidden were leaving. The tzvardeim, the frogs, we know that when they were commanded to go into the land of Mitzrayim, one of the things they did was they jumped with self-sacrifice into the ovens and they were burned up alive. So he says, if you think about it, all the dogs did was they kept their mouths shut. However, the frogs were willing to go and jump into fiery furnace and get burned up to smithereens. And the Reb Chaim has a whole shot before that, why that was such a unique thing. They could have jumped anywhere, he says, and the fact that there were frogs that chose, so to speak, to jump into the fire, that was a great act of Mesiras Nefesh. So he says we should reward the frogs with something great, to fulfill the will of Hashem. So they jumped into the fire, and yet we give nothing to the frogs. So he said, you see from this, that the sacrifice of the dogs not barking was greater than the frogs jumping into the fire. Said Reb Chaim Kanievsky, it's easier to leap into a burning furnace than to keep quiet. Easier to jump into a fire than to hold yourself back from saying the words that you want to say. So as we mentioned previously, the Yom Tov of Pesach is Pesach, the mouth that talks. A person that uses their mouth to say the right things and speak over the right words, they have tremendous koyach, a tremendous power in their mouths.